All right. So what are some of the options? We talked about a couple of them early on, right? So obviously there's going to be a subset of devices in most organizations that aren't going to be compatible to go to Windows 10. So out of the Microsoft environment, there are some options depending on where you're at and what you're looking at. And the first and foremost is going to be Windows 365, also potentially known as Cloud PC. So what this really comes down to be is this is a subscription service that you provide to a user inside of your M365 tenant. There's the business side, and then there's the enterprise SKU, and they're a little subtly different in terms of how they work, right? Obviously, business is similar to the M365 for business. There is a hard limit on how many of those you can have in a tenant, 300 specifically for Windows 365 for business specifically. Also, there is limited functionality from what you can provision and allocate here. So you're basically going to essentially assign a license. It's either on or off. They have access to that desktop. They log into their M365 portal and basically click to launch their desktop. Again, they're fairly rudimentary, but if you have users who simply need, again, Windows 11 with the Office suite and SaaS-based applications, may be an ideal configuration. These are also going to be running. One thing to note is these will just be hosted on the Microsoft network itself, right? No connectivity backend if you have an existing Azure networking or on-prem network, unless you work to install an application or VPN inside of that environment to tunnel you back in, right? These by default are going to sit in the Microsoft Azure network and be provided from that aspect. One thing to note down here in the bottom on the Windows 65 for Business is that if you transition, so again, if you have legacy Windows 10 devices that can't go to 11, if you go to Windows 365 for Business or Enterprise, Microsoft includes the extended security update benefits for your Windows 10 endpoint devices. So it's potentially a way to extend that end of life of those Windows 10 devices on-prem, allow you to move to Windows 11 via the Windows 65 business or enterprise environments, and still have the security updates on that end client that basically now just becomes a connectivity point into their desktop. So I want to make sure everybody's aware of that. That's one of the ways to avoid the ESU benefit to extend Windows 10 for devices that can't go to Windows 11, but you are then subscribing and paying for that Windows 65 for business instance. On the enterprise side, again, it's unlimited in terms of seats. The big thing here is that you have to configure the provisioning policies via Intune, and then you can actually customize those images. So you can get it down to a very precise image, similar to like what you would build on a physical desktop from an imaging and deployment perspective, or from like a EUC image that you can then deploy out and configure for those environments. Again, it has to be fully managed via Intune. Intune will do the deployment configuration as well as the policy and the app deployment at that point. If you have an existing Azure environment, you can connect it into your Azure tenant and deploy it into one of your Azure VNets. So you can actually integrate it with the rest of your environment and access from that perspective. And it does support both GPU and Intune for policy management. Um, Again, depending on where you're at and if you have an Active Directory environment in which you can enroll and provide that access for that endpoint device. One of the other things to note is that on the business side, I don't believe there's any way to give users admin rights in those desktops. So whatever you provision and have out there is what they get. On the enterprise side, you can provision those instances with admin rights for those end users. So in environments where the end users need to have admin rights, you're probably looking at an enterprise PC or enterprise Windows 65 enterprise only. All right, so a little breakdown then from an option perspective and some subscription aspect, right? Windows for Business, and again, because of the requirements of Windows 11, we generally wouldn't recommend anything less than 4 virtual CPU, and realistically, probably 16 gigs of RAM is the next really configuration. There's a 4 and 8, but I wouldn't do it. Half your RAM's already eaten up just in your OS. So these are some kind of caveats of what those subscriptions look like from a business PC or an enterprise PC model perspective. Obviously, you'll notice the enterprise is not as expensive. However, you own the entire Intune configuration process and provisioning aspects of those devices. So there's more administrative infrastructure and involvement in order to deploy those enterprise PCs. And so that's why there's a little bit of a decreased cost there. On the business side, Microsoft is handling all of that on your behalf.